That might be too close. Maybe. You know what? I'll work with it. Make sure that's going to work okay that well. Okay, so today we're going to be in Acts chapter 27. We're getting really close to the end of the book of Acts. There's only 28 chapters, and so this is the second to last chapter in Acts. And so we're getting close to the end. And the last few chapters, we've been looking at Paul as he's been on trial. And all of this has been leading up to Paul getting to go to Rome. And what we're going to see in this chapter is exactly that, the fact that Paul is finally getting to go to Rome. And like I said, this is what the last several chapters have been leading up to, is this thing here, the fact that Paul is going to get to go to Rome. You may remember he's been testifying before all these different governors and now these kings. He's testified under Felix. He's testified under Festus. He just testified to Agrippa in the last chapter. And now he's going to get to go to Rome in order to testify to Caesar. And you may remember how that came about is when Paul appealed to Caesar. He was testifying to Festus. Festus was kind of crooked. You might remember he was wanting to get Paul to go back to Jerusalem. Paul knew if he went back to Jerusalem, he was going to get killed. And so he made use of his right as a Roman citizen to appeal to the higher court and to appeal to Caesar. And so now Paul is going to get to go to Rome, and we're going to see how he is going to get there in this chapter. But as we're going to see, the journey is met with a lot of difficulty, things that are going to really push the boundaries, so to speak. And we're going to see in this chapter hopelessness. We're going to see a lot of turmoil, and we'll ultimately see some triumph at the end of this chapter. So this is the outline. This is the outline as it appears in your notes. We'll start with when they set sail. That's at the beginning of the chapter. And then there's going to be this storm that they run into out at sea. Then Paul is going to give some reassurance to the crew that's on board. And this will culminate toward the end of the chapter with this shipwreck. That is the climax of this chapter. Are there any questions or comments before we move on? Okay. So we start in the beginning of the chapter when they are going to set sail. And one thing to notice as we get into the beginning of this chapter is the language changes into the first person. Now, you may know this if you've been in English classes, how when we speak, there are different persons that we speak in. If you speak in the first person, that is inclusive of yourself, so that you'd use words like I did this, or we did this. That's first person. Second person is if you're addressing someone. I would say you do this, you did that. And then third person is if the people you're talking about are just not related at all. You'd say, well, he did this, she did this, they did that, so on and so forth. And so the language that this is in is mostly in the third person. When you read throughout the book of Acts, it's the narrator is kind of absent from the story. But now we see that the language is in the first person, which implies that the author, who we know is Luke, is present in this story. The fact that he's saying, we did this. Like in verse 1, it says, and when it was decided that we should set sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some of the other prisoners and so on and so forth. So you notice the shift in Luke's language. It's now all of a sudden in the first person. They decided that we should set sail. That implies that Luke, the author, is with them. He's with Paul at this point. And so Luke, the author, is present in this story. And as he points out at the beginning, the time has come for Paul and the others to set sail for Italy. Italy is where Rome is. Rome, of course, still exists today. You can go to Rome. Rome is a city that is in the country of Italy. Italy's where they have Italian food, right? And so you can still go to Rome. Rome is still in existence. It's not quite the same, but a lot of the ruins from this period of time and from the Roman Empire are still there. And so the time has come for Paul and the others to sail to Italy. And remember, this is obviously before airplanes were invented. Otherwise, they could have flown there. This is before cars were invented. Otherwise, they could have maybe driven there. It would have taken a little longer. But now they are sailing for Italy, and that's where Rome is. And remember what's happening here, that Paul is going to Rome at Rome's expense. Rome is footing the bill for this, more or less. Paul isn't having to put anything into this, anything out of his own money. And so he's going to go, he's going to get to Rome, and he's going to testify before Caesar about what all has been happening. There are a lot of people that are mentioned as part of this trip that you see in the first couple of verses. Obviously, Paul is part of this trip. He's kind of the main person that we're looking at. Luke is also included because of that first-person language. It was time they decided that we should sail for Italy. And so they delivered Paul and Luke to go. It also mentions in verse 1 that there are some other prisoners who are going to be part of this trip. Paul is one of them. He's a prisoner at this point. But there are other prisoners who are also going to go and evidently are going to testify in Rome. And so there's other prisoners there. Then there is Julius the centurion. And so this Julius guy, he's mentioned in verse 1. It mentions that he's of the Augustan cohort, and his name is Julius. And he is the guy who's kind of in charge of these prisoners. He's kind of the head guy. He's got other guards that are helping, but he's kind of the top guy in this. And about Julius, it's interesting that Luke mentions him by name, because you don't always see centurions mentioned by name. But I think the reason Julius is mentioned is because he treated Paul and the others favorably. It mentions in verse 3 that he was kind to Paul and that he would let him leave to see his friends, and he let Paul be cared for. It mentions there in verse 3. And so he was kind to Paul. He probably realized that Paul was a little different than the rest of these prisoners, and the fact that Paul hadn't actually done anything wrong. And so that might be why he gives him a little more leeway than he might some of these other prisoners. There's another person who's mentioned, and this person's name is Aristarchus. And Aristarchus is mentioned in verse 2. He is a Macedonian from Thessalonica. And so this is someone who's a companion of Paul's. We're not quite sure what his role was, if he was a helper, if he was someone who looked after Paul's needs, maybe some of his physical needs, or maybe if he was a partner in preaching. We're not quite sure who Aristarchus was, besides the fact that it mentions in verse 2 that he's a Macedonian from Thessalonica. And so we can be fairly certain that this person is a Christian, probably someone who Paul converted himself, because we know that Paul was in Macedonia, we know that Paul was in Thessalonica, and so this is probably a companion of Paul's, maybe even a partner in ministry. If not that, then perhaps someone who is just looking after some of Paul's needs. What we see as they begin this trip, this is the theme of this entire chapter, is the fact that the weather is not cooperating. They're wanting to get to Rome, they're wanting to get to a certain place, and obviously they're not going to make this entire trip in one day. They have to, take their time, because although it's faster than walking, it is still kind of a slow process that takes you several weeks, several months to get from Caesarea up to Italy. And the weather just does not cooperate with this trip. It mentions in verse 4, for example, that they had to sail under the lee of Cyprus because the wind was against them. Now, when it says that a couple times, that they're under the lee of something. What that means is that they're using the shore of that land. In this case, it's the shore of Cyprus. And not just the shore, but the land in general. They're using that as a shield from the wind. And so they're hoping that the land will shield them from some of the wind. And so they are under the lee of Cyprus because the wind had been against them. So they're trying to go in a certain direction, and the wind is just blowing against them, keeping them from going the way that they want to go. And so the wind is against them. That's a piece of this that's important. It also mentions in verse 7 that they sailed slowly, and they arrived with difficulty off of this place called Cnidus. And again, it's because of the wind. And so they have just run into a lot of trouble trying to get from Caesarea at least down the sea a little bit, maybe not quite to Rome in one trip, but they're trying to get, they're trying to get down the sea down the road, metaphorically speaking, because we know that they're in a boat. But they are having to sail really slowly, and so this is taking a lot longer than it is expecting them to. It also mentions, again, they're under the lee of Crete, and it mentions in verse 8 that they coasted along with difficulty. So this isn't an easy trip. We take for granted, if you're in a boat today, we take for granted the fact that boats have engines and that boats can kind of go against some of this stuff. Sometimes it's still kind of challenging depending on the size of the motor and so on and so forth. But we take for granted the fact, you have these big cruise ships and they go all over the place, and the weather doesn't play that much of a factor in terms of them getting to their destination. But this was a big part of this back then because they didn't have engines, right? They didn't have motors that they could put in boats. And so the wind kind of took them wherever they went, especially a ship like this. It's too big to paddle it, right? And so they're having to use sails, and they're having to have the wind take them where they're trying to go. And the wind was not being very cooperative. And so they're having to mitigate that a little bit. They're going slower than they want to go, and it's taking a lot more effort, perhaps, than they wanted. And so because of this weather not cooperating, a lot of time has passed. And because of the fact that so much time has passed, they are at a point now where they kind of need to stop because it's going to be dangerous if they keep going. And the reason for this is simply because of the time of year. This is now presumably in the late fall. It mentions in verse 9 that this is after the fast, and that's likely the Day of Atonement. That's what my footnote says in my Bible in verse 9. When it says when it says the fast, it says that is the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement is usually sometime in the late fall. So it's after that fact, and the late fall, when it starts to get cold and when the weather starts to act up a little bit, this is dangerous conditions for sailing. If you ever look up a lot of the shipwrecks that have happened in our country, especially in the northern part of Michigan, almost all of them happen in the fall. In particular, the late fall, as it starts to get a little colder, as winter starts to get closer and closer and closer. The colder weather makes for poor conditions for sailing. And so this is getting to the point where it's going to be really dangerous if they go any further. And Paul actually tries to warn them about this. He says in verse 10, he says, Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives. And so Paul warns them, hey, if we keep going and we don't stop somewhere for the winter, because they could stop somewhere for the winter and just stay there for a few months. They would still be in custody. They'd still be, imprisoned. They would just have to stop somewhere. And so Paul wants them to stop, but the people end up persisting and they end up keeping on. And so that leads now to the storm that they come across as they get to the sea. Are there any questions or comments? All right. So we get now to this section here about the storm at sea. And it's kind of funny. You know how in basketball you can kind of pump fake someone? You go up to shoot, but you don't actually shoot it and you fool them? Well, that's kind of what happens here with this, because it seems like they had the wind that they wanted. And so it mentions that the centurion, He paid more attention to the pilot. This is in verse 11. And so they are hoping to try to reach this place called Phoenix, which is, this is still in verse 12. It is a harbor of Crete. It's facing both southwest and northwest. They're hoping to get to that point and spend the winter there. And you see in verse 13, when the south wind blew gently, they supposed that they had obtained their purpose. And otherwise, they're thinking, oh, this is the weather that we're wanting. And so it seems like they have the wind that they wanted, and so they keep going. But eventually, this gentle south wind turns into what my version describes as a tempestuous northeaster. Your version might say something different, like a, I forget the particular word that's used, Eurocyclone or something like that. If it's tempestuous, that means it's really messy. That means it's really actually quite violent. And the northeaster is a well-known type of wind. And you see this even in America sometimes. Seems like maybe a couple years ago, there was a hurricane in the northeast, and they called that a northeaster. And because the winds were just so violent, and these northeasters, this is a type of wind, and they're well known for being violent winds, and it would often lead to shipwrecks. And what we come to here, once this northeaster strikes, is that the ship could not face the wind. In other words, the ship it can't go against it. It's going to have to just go with it. Wherever the wind takes them is where they're going to go. And the wind isn't taking them where they want to go. And the wind's actually taking them to a place where destruction is going to happen. And so this northeastern wind comes, and the crew of this ship, they brace themselves for what is going to be more or less a disaster. And so we see in the next few verses some of the preparations that they make. So it says, verse 15, when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we gave way to it, and we were driven along, running under the lee of a small island called Cauda. We managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. And so they secured this boat. That's more or less a lifeboat, like what we might think of today. The ship's boat. They're hoping to be able to escape. And so they hoisted it up. They used supports to undergird the ship. And then fearing they would run aground on the Syrtis, they lowered the gear, and thus they were driven along. And we see here now that in verse 18 that they start to jettison the cargo. And what that means is they're throwing the cargo overboard. And so they're having to throw stuff overboard. They're trying to lose weight on the ship. They're hoping that if the ship gets a little lighter, then they can have a little more control of it. But of course, that doesn't happen. And so this culminates in verse 20, when in verse 20 it says, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. And so they've lost any sort of hope in being saved. This is now a hopeless situation. And you can kind of sympathize with them a little bit, because it mentions in verse 20 that they haven't had sun nor stars. So they've just been in darkness for these last several days. They've just been in the dark. And this is a hopeless kind of a situation. And now we come to the point where Paul is going to reassure this crew. But before we get to there, are there any questions or comments? Okay. So we come to verse 21, and we see here that the crew has lost their hope. We see that in verse 20, but Paul hadn't lost his hope in being saved. And Paul ends up telling them initially here, hey, you should have listened to me, right? It almost sounds like an I told you so, but an I told you so is usually to rub it in their faces, but that's not what Paul is doing. What he's doing is, hey, I'm right about what I said before. I'm going to be right now. And so if they had listened to Paul, they wouldn't have incurred all of this injury and all of this loss. Because remember, they've had to throw the cargo overboard. That's kind of the main thing that this boat is doing. What's actually happening here, I didn't talk about it at the beginning, but Paul and the rest of these prisoners, they're actually hitching a ride with a ship that is carrying cargo. I think they're carrying grain, trying to get grain to a certain place. And so they're having to, throw this cargo overboard. They haven't thrown the grain overboard yet. They're going to end up doing that later. But they've been having to throw all this different cargo overboard. So they've incurred a lot of loss. They've incurred some injury, I'm sure. And again, what he's doing here, he's pointing out to them, hey, I was right before. You should have listened to me. Don't let that stop you, though, from listening to me now, because he has something else he's going to tell them. And so he's right about before, but he's going to be right about what he says next. And so, in other words, hey, you'd better listen to me. And so what Paul does is he urges them to take heart. Some versions might say to have courage. You might be wondering, well, why in the world would anyone have courage in this situation that is just totally hopeless, it seems? Well, the reason is because, according to Paul, there's going to be no loss of life. He tells them in verse 22, he says, "Yet now I urge you to take heart," or to have courage, "for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship." And so Paul tells them, hey, we're going to lose the ship, but none of us are going to lose our lives. And how Paul knew this is that the Lord had told him so. And so this comes in verses 23 and 24. It says, "For this very night there stood before me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship." So this angel comes to Paul, verse 24, and he said, "Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you." And so God is bringing Paul to Rome so that he can testify. And Paul is getting to Rome no matter what. If they shipwreck, then they shipwreck. Paul is going to end up getting there. And because God is protecting Paul, God is also going to protect these other people on the ship. And so there's not going to be any loss of life. They're going to lose the ship, but no one is going to lose their life. And the whole reason behind this is God tells Paul, you must stand before Caesar. And Paul has faith that the Lord is right. He says in verse 25, "So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told." Just as God said it, God is going to do it, and I have faith to believe that. That's what Paul says to the ship here. And so Paul gives them this reassurance. And what happens next is, more or less, they're going to have to crash the ship. So they're going to have to run aground on an island. If they're going to get out of the sea and get onto land, they've got to just make their way to land, whether the ship survives or not. And so they're going to run aground on an island. Running aground is when the bottom of your boat hits the ground. It's obviously not supposed to do that, but that's what's going to happen. And so they realize, hey, we're getting pretty close to land. This happens in verses 27 and 28. It says, "When the 14th night had come," so they've been out in this boat for 2 weeks. It's the 14th night. "As we were being driven across the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors suspected that they were nearing land." And so they kind of get a hunch, and they end up actually measuring for it. They took a sounding and found 20 fathoms. Fathoms is a unit of measurement. It's about an arm's length or about a wingspan. And so they measure once, and they get 20 fathoms. And then they measure again, and it gets to 15. And so it's getting closer and closer to land. And so they realize, oh, we're getting close. We need to brace for impact. And so they let down these 4 anchors. They're hoping that letting these anchors will kind of soften the blow, so to speak. And so they let down these anchors, and they also need a day to come. Because right now they can't see what they're doing. It's dark, it's stormy, They need milder conditions. They need day to come. They need to see. They need the sun to come up. And they need this so badly that they prayed for it. And this is interesting because these aren't necessarily religious people, but they prayed for day to come. And think about what Paul has told them. He's told them about God. This is the God I worship. He's told me this. And now they are praying for day to come. And so think about these men and the impact that these events is going to have on them. They're getting a close encounter with God here through these series of events out at sea. Paul has told them about God, and now they're depending on God. They're praying for day to come. And before they end up shipwrecking, which is what they're going to do, Paul gives them one last piece of assurance. He's assured them before, but now he's assuring them again. And he tells them that they need to eat. And he mentions here in verse 31, in verse 33, as day was about to dawn, Paul urged them all to take some food, saying, "Today is the 14th day you have continued in suspense and without food." So they haven't eaten in 14 days because of just the stressfulness of this situation. Chances are they've probably had to throw a lot of their food overboard anyway. And so they might have been trying to spare some of their food, save it for an opportune time. Well, now is an opportune time. Now's the time for them to eat. They haven't eaten in 14 days. And as Paul tells them, they're going to need their strength. He tells them in verse 34, he says, "Therefore I urge you to take some food, for it will give you strength. For not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you." And so he tells them to eat. And the reason that they can eat is because Paul, again, reassures them of their fate. The fact that not even a hair is going to perish from their heads. And so they can be certain of what's going to happen, but they're going to have to pony up and they're going to have to do it. They're going to have to buckle up and get ready for some impact, and that's exactly what's about to happen. And so Paul assures them again, and now it's time for this shipwreck to take place. Any questions or comments? Okay. So you may remember that they had been praying for day to come. Well, it finally does come in verse 39. It starts by saying, "Now when it was day." So day actually did come. And so now they're able to see, and they realize they're near this beach, but they don't recognize it. They don't know where they are. All they know is that there's land, and they're coming up to it pretty quickly. What they're hoping to do is to run the ship ashore. They're hoping to just make it cleanly from the sea to the shore without any hiccups, but they hit a reef. And a reef is just a big piece. It's just a big rock that's under the water. And all of a sudden now they're crashing and they're still in the middle of the sea. And so they didn't make it to shore. They have crashed. And actually a similar thing happened on D-Day. You may, if you don't know D-Day, that was the attack in World War II when our troops, the Allied troops, which included America and some other countries, they were going to storm this beach at Normandy in France. And their plan was to get closer to the shore and let the troops out, and they could storm that way. But they ended up hitting a reef too. Or it may not have been a reef, but they ended up crashing, and they had to prematurely leave the boat. And so then they had to swim through a bunch of water to get to the shore. And that's what is happening. That's what's happening to them now. They've hit a reef, and so they have crashed, and they're not even to the shore yet. And so now they have to make a swim for it. And these soldiers realize, hey, we've got to do something about these prisoners, because it's going to be awfully hard to keep up with these prisoners as we're swimming for our life. And so as they're crashing, they kind of make the decision, hey, we need to kill these prisoners. And that would have included Paul, because Paul is one of these prisoners. And the thinking behind this is it's better for the prisoners to be dead than to have escaped, at least from the point of view of the soldiers, because the soldiers are personally responsible for these soldiers. And if any of these soldiers escape through all of the commotion of this shipwreck that's happening, if any of them escape, then they're going to be guilty of letting them go, and they're going to get in big trouble. So from their perspective, it's better for these prisoners to just be dead than for them to escape. But fortunately, the centurion doesn't let them do this. And remember, the centurion is the one who's in charge. And he doesn't let them do this. And the reason is because he wanted to save Paul. It mentions in verse 42, it says, the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners lest any should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, that's the reason why, he kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for the land, and the rest on planks or on pieces of the ship. And so it was that all were brought safely to land. And so eventually, it mentions earlier, I don't remember where that is, that there are 276 people on this ship. And it mentions here in verse 44, and so it was that it mentions that all were brought safely to land. And so this is every person, all 276 people make it safely to the shore. And this is really an extraordinary thing. This doesn't happen very often. When you shipwreck and everyone makes it, think about the Titanic. Think about how many people were killed on the Titanic. All 276 people made it safely to shore, and we can confidently say that the reason for that is because of God's intervention. So that takes us to the end of this chapter. Here are some of the key takeaways from Acts chapter 27. And so one thing we see is we see God's providence on full display. And what that means when we think about God's providence is how involved God is, and how God is the one who is orchestrating these events. He's the one leading them through these circumstances. And so God is directly involved in a lot of this. It was seen first, like we've talked about before, leading up to these circumstances, the fact that Paul appealed to Caesar. We can see God pulling the strings, orchestrating the situation for Paul to be able to do that. And now we see it in God saving the people from the destruction of this shipwreck. If your ship crashes, chances are most people are not going to make it. In this case, every single person makes it. And it's not like it's an 8-person, ship. It's 276 people. They all make it. And we see God being directly involved in this, God saving the people. We also see Paul's faith rubbing off on some people. And it's interesting how Julius is so kind to Paul. And you can't help but wonder why Julius is so kind to Paul. Maybe it's because Paul was so kind to him. Maybe it's because Paul was a sociable person. He was a respectable person, treated others with respect, treated people with integrity. He was letting his light shine. I think that's a big part of it. I also probably think Julius just knew that Paul was innocent and he didn't deserve any of the bad treatment that some of these other prisoners deserved. And which, by the way, the fact that Paul was getting some of that treatment and yet he wasn't really batting an eye about it, that's another testimony of Paul's that he can share, is the fact that he's endured all of this suffering and he's willingly enduring it for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of Jesus. And so that, I'm sure, is something that rubbed off on Julius. We also see this in the fact that the crew prayed for day to come. These aren't people that are necessarily religious. We don't know what religion they are, if they had any religion. A lot of the Roman people were just simply pagans, and these are Roman people. A lot of them are just the crew of the ship. We don't know what they could be. They're just trying to get this grain to another place. But they prayed for day to come. And so we see them praying because of Paul. And now they have this great testimony. The fact that the God who Paul belonged to and the God who Paul worshiped, he said that in verse 23, this God saved them. And so now they have seen God's work through this situation. And, what kind of an impact is that going to have on them? Hopefully it has a monumental impact. Sadly, we don't really read anything about anyone else from this crew if some of them ended up becoming believers or what have you. But bottom line, they can know for certain that the God who Paul belonged to and who Paul worshiped, he saved them because Paul said it was going to happen, and then it did happen. That takes us to the end of Acts chapter 27. Next time we will get together, we will read Acts chapter 28. Thanks for being here, and hope you have a good rest of your day.